straight and narrow. Got it. Great. It hasn't been just through a straight and narrow path in higher education. My As Breeza stated earlier, my journey began in anthropology. I was examining cross-cultural comparisons, and I actually got into anthropology because I enjoyed the movie Indiana Jones, and I was like, oh, he's an anthropologist. He likes to go and an archaeologist, and he likes to study different cultures. But I moved into sociology and criminology in grad school, started studying institutions, inequality, identity, victimization, masculinity, all of those kinds of things, different types of social systems. Um, and how they, at first glance, these things might seem a little bit far removed from language education or institutional culture in higher education, but over time, I realized something that was very, very important, that at the center of all of these different institutions, whether we're talking about prisons, we're talking about schools, universities, or the workplaces that we're at, is that there's just a human experience of belonging that's very, very important. So even if we're studying our social justice system, or if we're studying higher education, we have to think about whether or not the people that are there, whether they feel like they're included, whether they feel safe, do they feel valued, who do we see, who's visible at these places? Do the people that are with us, do they feel heard? Do they feel understood? Do they feel welcomed? And do they feel like they're just capable of succeeding at our institution? I asked this question not just in these spaces, just because of the people that I was seeing, but also because of my own experience at these different types of institutions. Um, and increasingly, began to realize that sometimes it's not just the place that itself, but the language often determines whether or not these questions are answered in a positive manner by those that are at the institution. So I kind of wanted to take a moment to share my research trajectory, how it evolved from studying this social inequality to these and institutional systems to building what I now describe as a culture of care. And just to give you all a little bit more background, while I am faculty in social sciences, I also have worked in administration for the past 6 years as at first our director of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but now our faculty fellow for culture, inclusion, and belonging. But the work has still remained the same. And through that, I work with our president and our vice presidents on creating this culture of care that we have at GCC, at Glendale Community College. But it's grounded in building connections between people, building collaborations between departments, between the community and the institution, and then striving towards excellence. But all of these things are focused on the use of human-centered leadership, right? So how do we put the person at the center of everything that we do? And as I mentioned to you all, sociology is my passion. It's one of those things where I just enjoy learning about other humans, other places, the way that culture impacts how we do things. So my concentration, though, has been in criminology and gender and sexuality, but much of that earlier research focused on how the institutions shape the identity and the opportunities for the people that were a part of those institutions. So um, a little bit more in depth when it comes to what I actually studied. I studied masculinity and reentry, post-incarceration, anti-LGBTQ victimization, institutional trust, not just higher education institutions, but also our criminal justice institutions, criminological theory, and social belonging, right? And what fascinated me most was that not simply deviance or inequality themselves, but rather why do some institutions or some humans or some groups that we belong to create this feeling of alienation? Why do we isolate some people? And then why do other systems create transformation in those individuals? Not transformation in a negative way, but in a positive way. And so I was looking at the differences between the outcomes of the individuals based on the makeup of the institution that I was studying at the time. And so sociology gave me this language for understanding systems like systems of power, the norms in our social or cultural norms in a location, stratification, right? The division of humans, and that hierarchy that we create, but also identity formation for those humans and the institution and that institution's behavior. But sociology also taught me something else that was very, very deeply human is that people don't simply navigate these systems in an academic or rational way. Sometimes that navigation looks a little bit crazy. And as you can tell, I love a lot of animations just sometimes to take attention and keep people's attention, but it's also funny, but it tells the story, right? We navigate these systems sometimes very, very emotionally. And because of that, they may not remember what you said to them, they may not remember what you did, but people will remember whether or not they felt respected in our institutions, in our classrooms, in our presence. They will remember whether or not they felt invisible. They will remember whether or not they felt welcome. And they will remember whether or not they felt like they belonged in that place. So our feelings and our emotions are very, very important to how we navigate institutions, not just what we know when we come to the table or our rational brain, right? When we are offended, we don't usually always think rationally. We think with our emotions sometimes. We would like to get to that place, but at the core of each of us, we're a human being. So this became really, really important to me as someone who has navigated all of these different systems, like I shared with you all earlier. I have had a career over these past 17 years of being at both public institutions and private institutions, but also minority serving institutions and predominantly white institutions. I've also worked at religious institutions, liberal arts institutions, research universities, and community colleges. I've spent the past decade at a community college here in Arizona, but I also began my career at a community college in Louisiana. That's where I'm originally from, right? And across all of these different places, one thing has remained the same, whether it was with me or with anybody that I interacted with, is that people thrive most when their humanity and their dignity is acknowledged and respected. And that's what I've tried to bring into the classroom. And I've also tried to continue to bring that to the administration that I work with here in Glendale. When we think about people, we have to acknowledge their humanity and their dignity and respect who they are in order for them to do well. So over time, research interests have really led me to start examining institutions critically and asking a different question. How do we intentionally build an institution or a classroom or whatever space where we have control, some locus of control? How do we build an institution where all the people in that space can thrive and feel respected in that institution? So this shift in how I approach the work that I do has led me into leadership, administrative leadership, faculty governance, institutional effectiveness, which is where my job primarily is institutional effectiveness right now. Um, but how have I been able to bring this thought into rebuilding and shaping the organizational culture within higher education? And what I discovered is that many higher education institutions, we unintentionally create or communicate belonging through these hidden systems. We don't always think about and we blame things on the bureaucracy of the institution, but bureaucracies are built by people. And that means that we can change those institutions, we can change that environment. But we hide behind our policies, we hide behind the language that we use, we hide behind the classroom norms that we hide behind our communication styles. We hide behind our hiring practices, our what we feel is accessible, or what are the accessibility laws that we have in a particular culture. And we also make assumptions about what a successful employee or a successful colleague or a successful student looks like. We don't always say it, but we can tell through the people that are being able to be successful in our institutions that that institution was built for someone like who they are. And we expect everybody else to be just like those people. But we have a diverse landscape. We have a world where people come from all sorts of backgrounds and experiences. So, how do we build an institution that supports them while they are with us? Is the question that I began to ask. And one of the most powerful lessons that I've learned along my journey that I like to share with my colleagues and I'm going to share with you all today is that inclusion is not just merely demographic representation. It is relational. It is across the board. It is something that we have to think about the things we don't see as well as what we see, right? Our students, our colleagues, our community members, or anyone, and even yourselves, we ask ourselves, can I speak here? Can I bring my full identity? Can I speak the way that I normally would speak? Right? Will my knowledge be valued in this place, or will it be judged by the language that I use or the accent that I have, the dialect in which I speak? And I say all of these things coming from with my experience on hiring committees. I've seen people not be welcoming to an applicant just because they had a different accent or they spoke a different dialect, but I may have understood it because of where I come from, and other people may not understand those things. It's not to say that everyone operates that way, but I've seen those things in context, and I think that it's especially important in the work that I do here in Arizona because I'm at a Hispanic serving institution, and I'm not sure how much everyone on the call knows about the US education system, but we have these different institutions based on the populations that are largest in those institutions. It doesn't mean that everybody can't attend those institutions, but based on the population, many times we divide resources to make sure that we have equity across the country in the resources that might be needed in a particular place. So at this institution, the majority of our students are of Latino descent, depending on their context, but most of them come from places where either here in Arizona, because we have a large Latinx population, or other places throughout the Americas where people speak Spanish, and even in other countries as well outside of the continent that we are in over on this side of the hemisphere, right? Um, but in that context, it became increasingly important or obvious to me that I have a population of students that are bilingual or Spanish speaking as their native language, trying to navigate a system that was unintentionally not privileging the language that is their native language. It was unintentionally privileging one linguistic pathway, which is the English language. And I began to see these linguistic barriers from my students, and it wasn't just an individual student challenge, but it was an institution-wide challenge. And we also have 10 colleges where most of our colleges are like that in this region. So it was a district-wide challenge, not a system-wide challenge, not just one that was impacting the students that were in my class. So at some point, I realized I no longer wanted to only remain theoretical in thinking about how I do the work that I do, but I wanted to operationalize sociology. So I began to ask the question, what would it look like if we built institutions where language wasn't a barrier, or even who you are coming to the table wasn't a barrier, but language was used more. We built that institution around the individual and valuing human dignity as opposed to institutional convenience, right? We've operated a particular way and we expect other people who come to us to navigate how we've built that system, as opposed to building a system that responds to the people that come to us, right? So as an educator, I understand that each of my classes are different. I have to navigate each of those classes instead of expecting them to just mold to how I expect the classroom to operate, right? I shifted based on the people that are there. So this led me to do a lot more work around a culture of care. And I did these things because I came from Louisiana where we spoke English most of the time. We had very little Spanish there. We have more now than we had in the past. Moving over to Arizona, where that is one of the primary languages that is spoken in this place, right? So I had to start navigating that. And I moved over to this work focused on a culture of care. This is really the bulk of a lot of the work that I do currently. Um, Working in institutional effectiveness, I work with each of our vice presidents, our associate vice presidents, all of the leaders of the college to create this culture of care. And I'm sharing this culture of care because this is how we're operating here at GCC, where we focus on this connection, um, collaboration, and excellence, these different pillars where we're trying to focus on belonging, empowerment, engagement, but also shared responsibility and mutually beneficial outcomes for everybody who is involved in the work that we get a chance to do here at GCC. But all of this is focused on creating an institution that is excellent. What we mean by excellent is that we focus on innovation, not the creation of something new that could be part of what we're focused on, but it's not the end all on our in our focus, but more so the how we do things might be a little bit different from what others might do. But also, how do we continuously improve and grow as an institution and not just be one note, right? We want to be a little bit different. We want to respond to culture shifts and contextual shifts. We also want to be resilient and we want to ensure that our students are able to be successful at this institution. We want them to be able to thrive, and not just our students, but also all of the employees that are at the institution, right? But what is important most about this framework is that it moves beyond abstract institutional rhetoric and moves towards action. We ask the question, what behaviors actually communicate that we care at GCC? You know, do we listen to people to understand them or do we listen to respond to them? Right? We want to move towards that place of understanding. We want to be able to provide the clear guidance that is needed. We want to provide warm handoffs. And what I mean by that is, I don't want to just tell people where the resources are. I want to take them to those resources so that they know that we care, but we are also able to introduce them to the resource and they don't have to worry about doing it themselves, right? Um, we want to acknowledge the effort and the growth of everyone that is around so that they feel valued at this institution. And we want to just overall reduce the barriers, not reproduce barriers. So that's a lot of what the work that I do right now, and it deeply influences how I understand and enact my own personal leadership, whether it's leadership in the classroom or leadership among my colleagues. The leadership is not just strategic planning or organizational management, but more so leadership that focuses on the environmental design, right? Is it the what I'm creating, is it intentionally, is trying to intentionally shape the spaces where people feel like they're capable of succeeding at the institution? And I wanted to say that perhaps one of the clearest examples of my work right now is the project that I'm currently creating. And this one is as an educator, as a person, as a faculty member in the classroom, one of the things that I'm doing. That work that was on the previous slide is what I do in my administrative role. And then what I'm doing in the classroom is I'm creating a project where um, developing a fully Spanish language introduction to sociology course. In the past few years since I've moved here to Arizona, um, this work has taken a little bit of time for me to continue to develop because I've used translanguaging in the classroom because I heard students talk about how they understood the concepts and the ideas, but language was the barrier that they had. And for those of you, I'm assuming probably everybody on this call speaks more than one language, and we've been in those spaces where it we can understand things, but the reproduction of that language becomes a challenge for us, right? And I felt like if students possess this sociological insight and critical thinking capacity and these different lived experiences, however, they can't fully demonstrate because of language barriers, then maybe I should reconsider what I believe is academic legitimacy and then maybe translate that into the institution. And we should question whether or not the exams that we have do those fully create a space where students are able to demonstrate their full academic knowledge, their repertoire, especially if it's in a language that's not their own, right? Not their native language. So this was not something I could control fully in terms of the institutional capacity, but I did have the capacity to change it on my own personal level in my classes and with my students. And I also get a chance to work with our Center for Teaching and Learning Excellence. And in that center, I work with other faculty members, even if they are not multilingual or bilingual or any of that, but being able to be more flexible with students that may speak other languages and being able to have more patience with those students and other ways that they can engage with the work. So I didn't know it at the time that I started using translanguaging, but it became more and more important to the work that I was doing in the classroom and across the institution. And I also began to understand that and think about it this way. I've never thought about translanguaging as code switching. And when I hear the term code switching, I think of who I am and where I came from. As I shared with you earlier, Louisiana is the only state in the US where we mix French, and some people only speak French. We have French speaking communities, we have people who speak Creole. And in general, though, our English mixes French with English, and we change the structure of English. It wasn't until I was almost 30 years old and I moved away from the state that I recognized I wasn't speaking English because other people didn't understand me. And so I was used to changing. And for those that don't know, the African American population, we're only about 14% of the population, and we speak English in a little bit of a different way, especially those that are from Louisiana. And so, in different contexts, I would have to change how I spoke English. For me, that was translanguaging. I'm sorry, not translanguaging, it was code switching. But when I started thinking about translanguaging, I think, okay, there's so many different ways that language has to be spoken in order for the listener to understand the message of the person who's sending out the message. That included dialects, accent, communication styles, depending on social context, the audience, or even the environment, whether it was work or you were just out with your friends, right? And so I began to think code switching for me was the either or. I'm doing one or the other of these things. But when it came to translanguaging, the or became and, and it involved all of these things, especially for multilingual students that are in the classroom. So rather than asking my students to start to suppress part of themselves academically, I use translanguaging to allow them to bring their full linguistic capacity into that classroom, whatever they needed in order to get the message across. And I did the same as the educator in that space, trying to create that welcoming environment. Doesn't mean we didn't have other languages, because I did have students with other languages as well. And we have so many tools to help us get through those challenges that's why this form of pedagogy became more important for the work that I did. And I also began to think about one of the things that people don't always recognize when it comes to the US. We're not an English only country. We don't have an official language. Most of us, I will say, most of us that grew up here don't always know that either. And that's because of the education system that we have. It's not one that always let informs the students as they're growing up that English is not our official language. We have none, but it's the language in which we use in terms of our official documents, but we also have those documents available in other languages as well. But this also let me know that there is something else that not having that official language did for us that was very, very valuable. It it gave me the idea that variance in language and how I express concepts and what language I use to ensure that students understood everything, it was a way to validate the experiences of all of the linguistic plurality or diversity that we have here in this country, right? Yes, we use English sort of as a general way to communicate across different groups, but we also value the diversity of the languages that they brought. Because those of you that speak multiple languages, you know, sometimes you have to think not sometimes, but all the times you have to think in a different way. So you get to see the world in a different way. I thought that was a very, very beautiful aspect of this country, even though it's not always appreciated by everyone who is here. It is one of the most beautiful things that we have to offer the world, but also to offer our students in the educational context that we have, is to validate and to value the linguistic complexities in which they come to us in, because they have other ways of expressing ideas that we may not even have a word for. So we figure out how to navigate those spaces. And for me, the question just became, it was important to ask what happens when we stop viewing this multilingualism as remediation, because we do have remedial classes, but stop viewing it that way, but begin to view it as intellectual richness, because we have to see the world differently in order to contextually speak these different languages. So I think in higher education, this is really this ed in higher education because language it's important because language is often tied to our identities. It's tied to student confidence. It's tied to whether or not they want to participate in your classes. It's tied to the authority in which we exert in our positions. And it's tied to belonging. And that's why the work that you all do in applied linguistics and in teaching language, English language teaching, it matters profoundly because you're not only teaching a language, but you're shaping the access to participation you're shaping the identities of the students. You're also shaping the opportunities that they're going to have, but not just the opportunities for the students in your class, but also for the communities in which they come from. We want to make spaces where the students are able to benefit those spaces where they come from. And so many students have to leave those spaces because they don't have opportunities or they don't have or they may be trapped in those spaces because of the linguistic barriers. So one of the greatest lessons that I've learned in my years of higher education, especially as an educator who works in administration, is that this idea of care or inclusion based on diversity can exist at just the interpersonal level, but it has to be built into the institution. I wouldn't, when people say that systems are broken, I don't think of systems as broken. I think of them as being built in the ways that we have built them, right? The outcomes that we get, it's based on what we have put in that system. And if we are able to shift that system, then we can change the outcome. We can change it. We can institutionalize different practices so that everybody is able to thrive in those spaces. So I know that individual faculty members, we care about students, but if the systems remain confusing, inaccessible, or rigid or alienating, then the students still experience institutional harm, whether or not we care about them as individuals, right? So the question now becomes, how do we institutionalize this care? How do we build it into the system, this form of care that we're trying to achieve? This means that we have to start designing accessible systems. We have to value multilingualism. We have to build relational trust between ourselves and our students, and even our colleagues. We have to be supportive employees or supportive colleagues, and we have to create environments where that human dignity is recognized and it's respected within the sphere of which we operate, right? And we have to align our policies with human realities, right? We can have a policy, but if it doesn't match the reality of a lived experience of a human, then that policy is not going to be effective in helping that person be able to thrive at our institution. Um, and this work is not separate from thinking about how that institution becomes excellent. In fact, I would actually argue that human-centered aspect of the institution produces the strongest outcomes precisely because people are able to thrive where we actually feel like we are connected to that place. We do well when we are connected to the place, when we're engaged at that place. So the future of higher education in this aspect will require that our institutions are capable of one, being flexible, being responsive to changes in the society, being empathetic to the people that are at those institutions, being able to be collaborative because we can't do everything alone. Um, we will be successful if we're able to use intercultural communication, right? We're able to communicate across cultural linguistic barriers. And if we use relational leadership, we no longer can just see the employee or the student as a student. We actually need to see them as a human because people are able to recognize now their humanity even in ways that they haven't in the past. We as institutions have to also do those things, right? And this work becomes even more critical and increasingly in this sort of increasingly diverse multilingual landscape, but we're also more globally connected now with technology. So this work becomes much more valuable and important and critical to what we are doing in higher education. So thinking about I try to think about how do I close out this talk and what do I want to leave you all with as we move forward. It's just a simple idea. Institutions and you as an individual, as a part of that institution, as an educator, we teach people how they matter. We teach people how they matter through the curriculum that we share, through that curriculum that we construct. We teach them how they matter through the policies that we develop at that institution. We teach them how they matter through the language that we use in our classes, in our offices, with our colleagues, in the policies that we develop. Do we have those things in multiple languages? And we also teach them who they are through our silence. When they are bringing concerns to the table and we're not addressing them, if we are not acknowledging them, whatever it may be, we are teaching people whether or not they matter based on whether or not we say anything. So the question for all of us becomes, what kind of systems and institutions are we helping to create as future educators, researchers, institutional leaders? You have a tremendous power in shaping the environment where students and your colleagues feel like they're visible, whether or not multilingualism is valued, whether you center humanity, or if belonging is intentionally cultivated in that space. My own journey from criminology to and institutional inequality research to translanguaging and organizational culture, um, to this culture of care work that I do currently in institutional effectiveness as an administrator. This work has taught me that education is most transformative when people don't have to leave parts of who they are, parts of themselves behind in order to succeed. That doesn't mean that we don't teach people, and especially our students, that there are different contexts or cultural contexts or situational contexts in which who we are, we bring a different energy, we bring a different representation of who we are to that space. Authenticity doesn't mean that we as an individual cannot contextualize our behavior and the language that we speak based on the social context or the social infrastructure of that place. It just means who we recognize that as humans, we are flawed individuals and we do things differently depending on where we are. Um, Depending on the context and the people in which we are working with. All of those things matter to the space, but we allow people to be the human that they are in those spaces. So I guess um, just to reiterate that last point, because I think this is the most important part of work as you're thinking about how you move forward and the diversity in which you're going to encounter different people in the future is that again, no matter what space we're in, um, whether it's education, whether you are in other, I don't know what other context you might use your academic or your expertise. But again, education is most transformative when people are not, they don't have to leave parts of themselves behind in order to succeed. And I think you have to remember your own experience and what made you feel best if you are able to just be yourself without thinking about, well, what do I need to change because of the people in front of me are not going to respect that. They're not going to welcome that difference of opinion or that difference in expression. Um, I think you always feel the best when you can just say the things that you need to say and understand that you don't have to change who you are in order to be great in that space. I think we briefly mentioned earlier that I'm an artist. You probably can't tell much because I'm in my office right now, but I have a lot of art in my home office. But here, I paint, I draw, I act, I sing, I dance. I mostly do a lot of dancing these days. And as I work with new people or I work with a new choreographer, one of the things I always have shared with dancers is to learn to take the note without the emotion. And what that means, taking the note without the emotion, is that I'm allowing the person who is expressing the note to be a human, but I'm also allowing myself to be a human, meaning we have good days, we have bad days. And sometimes when we express a note or give feedback, it may not come off in the most positive way or most constructive way, but I give feedback because I care and I know that the person is capable of doing better in those spaces. And I want them to look their best when they present whatever the work is that they're doing. But also, I might be having a wonderful day, but the person who is receiving that note may not be receiving that note in the best way because they're having a bad day. They might hear something else and not what the actual note is. And so I say to you all, in those spaces as an artist, I learned to allow people to be human and have those bad days. And I listen to what is the constructive feedback, what is the note that they're giving me. And they're only giving me this note because they care about who I am as a person. And I think that that allows them to have their day and me to have my own day as well. And I can be my authentic self and they can be their authentic self. So as long as we don't force people to have to leave parts of who they are behind, then they're in a much better space to be able to succeed on their own in the spaces that we create as educators. So with that, I wanted to leave a little space to one, thank you all for allowing me to be here, but I wanted to leave space for questions and other comments that I can talk about in this space with you all. We have a little under 20 minutes here, but I wanted to leave some space to be able to ask questions and to engage in a little bit more conversation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see everyone again. Hopefully I can see people. Okay, great. I can see people. You can feel free to use the chat or unmute yourself, but I wanted to leave space for anything that I talked about that you may want to expand on or want me to review or further explain. And thank you all.
Thanks, doctor. So if someone has questions, it's time now. So you can ask or make comments. Carla, do you have questions or comments?
Yes, it's a comment about what you say on how we create this safe space for our students in order to feel like our feedback is not something negative but something positive and rather from somewhere they can actually learn. And this is related to my teaching experience because this Thursday we finish our courses in one of the schools I work at. And this was precisely one of the comments that some students made to me, like they felt that my feedback towards them was not mean and was actually constructive. And I felt really flattered about that because that's what I am trying to do as a teacher. I am trying to not to make the same mistakes that were done towards me when I was a student of the language that make me feel contract about it, that made me feel like this was not a safe space to actually ask questions and be myself. So this presentation that you just gave us gave me so many insights on what to think about on my future classes, because I want to continue being this person that opens this space for everyone to feel safe, to learn, to question, and to speak, because we know that that one is the most challenging skill for students to develop sometimes. So this presentation really, really helped me and influenced on how I see the communities that we make towards our students. Thank you so much for your knowledge, Dr. Alexander. It was very insightful of you.
No, no problem. Thank you so much. I think one of the things I share at the beginning of my classes for my students, I tell them if I haven't learned anything from them, then they haven't done their job. I'm not here to just share knowledge because I don't experience the world that they experience or like them. I experience it from my own perspective, and I'm sharing theories and theoretical knowledge of
Mhm.
that has been contextualized and developed in another time, but how we might experience it as an individual, I want to know that information. So I want them to question all of the things that I share in that class. So thank you. I'm
And
glad that
see
you
you.
were able to hear that.
Yes, thank you so much. This is very useful for us as teachers, as constructive teachers, because not all of the community does these practices, and it should be at least a standard somehow. So we all kind of offer the same safe space for our learners. But thank you so much, Doctor.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you, Doctor. Now, Marlene, do you have something to ask?
Yes, Brisa. First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was a very reflective presentation that made me think about my own teaching practices. I really appreciate the way that you connect the multilingual teaching with the students' sense of belonging and inclusion in higher education. But I have something to ask you. What challenges do teachers face when they are trying to move away from traditional monolingual approaches and create more inclusive multilingual classroom? Because I know that, for example, here in Mexico, we have a huge problem, I could say, with some of the institutions. And sometimes it's like very difficult for us to try to make those changes.
Okay, so thank you for that question. And I think one of the different, at least as a country here in the US, we have different policies that are in place depending on the institution. And I feel like your question is mostly focused on trying to navigate creating a space where you're able to use multilingualism in a class where you're specifically focused on language, and then there are different schools of thought that full immersion is best for students to acquire that language versus trying to explain the new language that they're working on in the language that they already know, right? And so, depending on the subject matter, sometimes educators might face the same challenges that you're in, but I don't necessarily teach language. I use the languages in order to teach other content. And so I don't run into that same challenge. So I think the subject matter, to answer your question, subject matter can be a challenge for educators when they're trying to use multilingualism in the classroom, but also depending on that space, because our private institutions don't have to operate the same way that our state and public institutions have to operate. Our state and public institutions are open to other, or should I say, our private institutions, they have their own set of rules. They have very, very few that they have to follow in terms of public institutions. Our public institutions have to we are responsive to the public needs. So whatever the public needs and the policies that we create, that's what we have to respond to. And our policies don't usually dictate the language that we have to speak in the public institutions. In the private ones, money is the driver. So money tells them that they have to do it a certain way. So depending on the institution and depending on the subject matter, I think that's where the barriers become difficult. Um, I wouldn't say that it's uniform across the US when it comes to teaching language either. Depending on the schools, different schools have different policies that they require that their faculty use, but also depending on the level. For us, higher education, we have a lot more flexibility and freedom than our K through 12, our primary and secondary schools. They have more stipulations on what they can teach and how they can teach those things. So that's a complex question for this context in which I work here, but I would say subject matter can be a barrier. The type of institution can be a barrier, and the level in which the faculty member is teaching. Those are the three things that I think create the most barriers here in the US. But again, it's flexible depending on where we're coming from.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for your answer, Doctor.
No problem.
Thank you, Marlene. Thank you, Doctor. We have a comment here in the chat. It says, I agree, feedback is very, very important, but also I would like to add the importance of human feedback. Nowadays, I have seen teachers using AI to give feedback and students notice it and feel discouraged. I have heard students complain about this because they feel they spend time working on their assignments and then teachers not even giving them real feedback. Sorry, I cannot open my microphone because I am in a place with a lot of people.
That's an interesting point. I just had this conversation, but I had it in the opposite way with one of our faculty members is that the students are using AI here in this particular institution to respond. So the faculty member told the student, if you're going to use AI to respond, then I'm going to use AI to respond to the answers that you provide. And the lesson that the teacher is trying to let the student know is that why waste your time and resources and your money on having a college education if you're not going to participate in that education? So I do understand what students are saying here in this space where the they don't want the faculty to use AI because they put all of this time and this work and this energy in. I think depending on the context of that, the assignment that they're using and the traditional methods in which we have graded or assessed students, AI can, I think we need to be more responsible in teaching how to use AI. I think that's probably the shortest answer and the most concise point that I'm trying to make is that we have we have allowed ourselves to create new inventions, but not teach people how to use them. We allow capitalism to create a space where we create a new invention and we just give it out to the masses and we don't think about what the repercussions are. I think um, literacy, when it comes to the impact of artificial intelligence and how we use it responsibly, that is what is lacking. And I think as educators, what I try to teach my students, I don't run away from them using it, but I do let them know that it's not going to be a benefit when you are in a conversation with a person and they're expecting an answer from you in that moment, or you're in a social context where you're interacting with other humans. You can't just use AI to respond to the humans. You are, I teach human interaction, so you have to figure out how to interact with them. So it lends itself well to my class to where I can talk about the value and the importance of focusing on the work without the use of AI. But if you are going to use it, then I as an educator need to understand that you know what you're talking about. So when I detect that it has been used, I usually set up meetings with my students and I do a verbal assessment of their knowledge. And that's one way as educators that if you do find yourself with working with students that are using AI, changing how you assess them allows you to assess whether or not they have actually grasp the information that you're trying to share. When it goes the other way, where students are worried about faculty members, they can try to engage them in conversations around whatever the work is that they're working on, whatever the homework was or the assignment was, having conversations with the faculty member about your work ensures that they understand what you turned in, especially if that work comes back and you don't get the grade that you think is the grade that you deserve. I would encourage my students to question me on that so that they know that I understood their work, I understood their assignment. And I know that that's hard for a student to think, well, how can I question my professor because they are the ones that are in charge at that time? I wouldn't say go into that space with, oh, I'm here to question you about your work ethic. No, my question is, I would like to engage you in a conversation around the assignment that we just did. What that does, it gives the student the opportunity to further explain and talk about that assignment to ensure that the professor knows that they know the information, but also for that student to engage that professor in the discussion. So it's not like the work that they did goes in vain. It's just further expanded, and they're both on the same page to where they're still able to share their knowledge in that space. I hope that made sense.
Yes, thank you, Doctor. I have one final question. You, at some point of your presentation, you mentioned the importance of considering like the context, for example, of students in this case, and that caught my attention because I am doing research in a Mexican private school where there is imposed the English only policy. And here, administrators or coordinators in this case ask teachers to implement the policy without considering students' needs, just like a rule, just like, okay, you're going to do this. And well, they are not considering students or even teachers, how they implement the policy. So what would be like your advice in this type of context in order to create a more like talking about like something more like considering the teachers and also considering the students' needs in order to if they want to implement the policy, if they think that that's effective to be speaking only English in a place where they only speak Spanish, well, it's okay, but considering what students need and also what teachers think about the policy.
Okay. So I don't know if academic freedom is something that is implemented widely in other cultural contexts, but I know in the US we do allow our faculty to have academic freedom. And what that is it's the idea or the principle that as educators, researchers, or even students in higher education, we have the opportunity to pursue knowledge, to teach knowledge, and to publish the knowledge that we develop without censorship or unreasonable interference. So we get to decide how we teach, what we teach, right? Because of our expertise. We can engage in university policies or institutional policies. We try to create a conversation between that and the faculty's autonomy in how they impart the knowledge, impart the information. But we also try to align our practices as educators with the mission of the institution. So if the institution's mission is for students to engage in a space where they are totally immersed in this particular language, if that's the mission, then we do our best to create a space where that immersion can flourish. But we also have the autonomy to recognize something that is not working in that academic space, and we can shift it if we need to in that moment, but also reinforcing to the student, hey, I'm explaining this in this way, but I want to remind you that the mission of this particular institution is that we're able to create this space where you're fully immersed in this language. So it's a constant navigation and conversation between our academic and pedagogical autonomy through the use of academic freedom, but also trying to align our practices and what we do to help the institution meet the needs or meet their mission and their vision, which that is a constant conversation. And anytime we have to shift anything, there is transparency in how we communicate why we are doing this shift and to whom we are doing that shift with so that they understand why we're doing it and why we may not remain in that space so that they know, one, we care, and two, we're also trying to help the institution meet its mission. And they, as a participant in this institution, are engaging in that space with that particular mission. I hope that is clear. Like there's a constant navigation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you
Mhm.
so much, Doctor. Okay, is there any comment? Okay, well, I think that we are going to stop here, Doctor. And well, it was a pleasure to hear your presentation. And well, thank you so much.
Thank you all, and thank you all for listening and for being here with me this morning. I appreciate it. And I'm happy to answer any questions beyond this. I had my information in there. I'll put my email in the chat if anybody needs it as well. But thank you all for having me this morning.
Thank you, Doctor. Okay, so I think that right now we are going to take a break and we are going to come back at 10:15.